Well, hey everybody, I hope you're having a terrific week. Thanks for making CCC part of your 4th of July weekend. We've been studying the life of David this summer because he's an incredible character in the Bible and he's one of the more dominant figures in the Bible. And what we're zoning in on in his life is his heart. He had a heart that God just loved. And so we're learning about what characterized his heart. You can read about David's life in several books in the Bible, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Chronicles, a little bit of 1st Kings, along with the Psalms. Many of the Psalms were written by David. More than 66 chapters in the Bible are devoted to David's life, and he's mentioned close to 700 times throughout the Bible. And we're mainly tracing his life through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, though. And we've explored when David went up against Goliath and when David was on the run from Saul and when David relocated the ark. Today, we're going to look at David and somebody named Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, who many of you will remember was David's oldest and best friend, and he was the son of King Saul. And at the time we're introduced to Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel, Saul and Jonathan, they've died. They're gone. But Mephibosheth, he's still alive, and he appears on 3 occasions in the life of David. You know, the first time we meet him is in 2 Samuel 4. He's 5 years old at the time, and news had come down the pike that King Saul and Prince Jonathan, they'd been killed by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa in the Battle of Jezreel. And panic just set in around Saul's palace. You know, the Philistines, they were ruthless. And with Saul and his son dead, anybody in the royal household was sure to be put to death. They would have no mercy to anybody connected to Saul and Jonathan. And so expecting the worst, all the servants in the palace, they just ran for their lives. And 5-year-old Mephibosheth's nurse grabbed him, and as she was running, she tripped. And in the fall, Mephibosheth's ankles were broken. And the Bible says his nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. The bones, they just never healed properly, and Mephibosheth was never again able to walk very well. But he was taken east across the Jordan River Valley to a place that was called Lo-Debar. Now, Lo-Debar means no pasture land. So it wasn't a great place. You know, Mephibosheth is taken to a place that's desolate and barren, no pasture land. And he's just hiding out there. He's laying low because his life would be in danger if anybody knew he was of royal lineage. And so he grows up in obscurity with his royal identity just kind of suppressed, all aggravated by his condition. That's the first episode with Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel 4. And then comes chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, which happens many, many years later. Mephibosheth is now an adult. He's still disabled because of the accident. And more than likely, he's a bit bitter about the way life has dealt him some difficult cards. In fact, Mephibosheth's name means seething dishonor. And one day, some strangers show up to Lo-Debar asking for him, and they tell him that he's wanted in Jerusalem, the capital, and he's wanted there by none other than King David. And we got to believe that struck fear into Mephibosheth's heart. He's probably thinking, you know, the jig is up. I've been found out. They know who I am. They know where I am. It's over for me. And so they put Mephibosheth on a donkey and they take him to Jerusalem, and every step is just bringing him closer to his doom as he's just expecting the worst. And we would too. I mean, the custom was to kill anyone from a previous dynasty. But when Mephibosheth is brought into David's presence, he's completely caught off guard. What Mephibosheth didn't know and never could have imagined in his wildest dreams is that a few days earlier, David asked if there were any descendants of Saul around whom he could show some kindness because of his dear friend Jonathan. Check it out. 2 Samuel 9, verse 1 says, David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, that word kindness is the Hebrew word hesed. It's a word that often gets translated kind of narrowly into our English word love. Now here it's translated kindness, but it's a really, really large word, and really no single word in our English language is adequate. And so we kind of revert to the use of adjectives to bring out the many qualities, the very distinctive qualities and the broad reach of that word. We'll say things like, or it'll be translated with things like steadfast love, or loyal love, or covenantal love, or loving kindness, those kinds of things. Some say it should be translated grace here in 2 Samuel 9. Is there anyone left that I can show grace for Jonathan's sake? Hesed is love without regard to shifting circumstances, without regard to, emotional states or personal convenience. It's the kind of love to which we aspire when we take marriage vows to love in sickness and in health, for better, for worse, until death parts us. And it's the kind of love that God loves us with. Make note of that. It's the kind of loving kindness God shows us. And it's worth noting here that David asks, is there anyone? Like he doesn't ask, is there anyone qualified? Or is there anyone worthy? He just says, is there anyone, regardless of who they are? Grace, CCC, operates apart from the response or the ability of the individual receiving it. Grace, it's one-sided. And I'll repeat it again, it's the way God deals with us. So understand what's going on here, all right? David has accomplished some incredible things on the front end of him becoming the king. Like he puts the Philistines in check. He unites the north and the south of the nation. He makes the capital city Jerusalem. And as we saw last week, he brings the Ark of the Covenant back to the capital, signaling the call for the Israelites to put the worship and obedience of God just front and center in their lives. And now he's kind of ready to roll up his sleeves and get to the nitty-gritty work of being the king. And what does he do? He begins with grace. He begins with love. He begins with kindness. He begins with hesed. See, standing before Mephibosheth that day was a different kind of king than the world in which he had grown up in had. See, paranoia and jealousy characterized his grandfather, King Saul's reign. But now David, he had accomplished a transition from the just disorderly mess that was left over from Saul's rule. One chapter earlier in 2 Samuel 8, we get this short descriptor of when David first comes to power. The Bible says this, so David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Justice and equity. That's what rulers are established by God to work for and bring about. And David was doing it. But David's reign, it was still young, and the news hadn't reached the remote, desolate land of Lo-Debar. So Mephibosheth, before David now in 2 Samuel 9, he's expecting to be put to death. Just the brutal reality of the fact that he was a possible rival to David's throne, and David would just snuff him out. But instead, Mephibosheth is the recipient of David's grace. He was there to be loved by David. This scene here is a critical, defining moment of David's life. David is now in a position of deciding how he's going to exercise his role as a king. And the question is, what will he choose as sort of the navigational means for his life? Is it going to be power, or is it going to be love? Will he manipulate and manage so he can control, or will he be open and generous so he can love? And he answers that question through Mephibosheth. From a place of security, David exercises his power by looking for ways to love. An umbrella of grace will be his MO. Do you see this? See, what we're seeing is the cultivation and expression of a gracious heart. And look how he goes about it all. David's first word to Mephibosheth is his name. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor, and David said, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, you see, is recognized as a person. He isn't a nameless exile, and he isn't a category of a victim. He has a name, and David knows it. Mephibosheth. In fact, the name Mephibosheth is used 7 times in this story of their first meeting without a hint of denigration in the usage of it. So from now on, Mephibosheth, he's got a different definition of who he is. He's defined by grace. He'll get his identity from Hesed, loving kindness. Mephibosheth is a name, and names are personal, gang. See, we can't love in general. We can have a loving feeling sometimes, and we think that we're a loving person because of it. Like we hear a song and we say, that touched my heart, so I must be loving. Or we're moved by some movie or TV show and we think, oh yeah, I'm full of love. Or we tear up at a touching commercial and we conclude, I'm definitely full of love. But all we're doing is, philosophically agreeing with the idea of being a loving person. We're loving in theory. We want to be loving. But we can't love in general. We can't love in categories either. We can't even love, I dare say, by decree or legislation. We can only love a named person who has a past, a present, and a future. Mephibosheth, David says. And then David gives him a word of reassurance. He says to Mephibosheth, don't be afraid. Now, we come across that phrase all the time in the Bible. Don't be afraid. And it's there for a reason, because there's much to fear in life. We constantly meet up with people who have, more power than we have. And we wonder, how will they use their power and how will they use their authority? Will they diminish us? Will they exploit us? Will they use us? Will they get rid of us? And so we learn to be cautious and we learn to put up defenses. And then we come before God, God of power and mystery. And we wonder the same thing. How will He treat us? Will He punish us? Will He destroy us? Will He get rid of us? And that's why we need so much reassurance. Hey, relax. It's going to be all right. Don't be afraid. And that phrase was so often on the lips of angels when they were delivering a message for God. And it was often on the lips of Jesus, who regularly, He brought frightened and just confused men and women into the very presence of God. Here, it's on the lips of David. Mephibosheth, he had every reason to be deathly afraid of David at this very moment in 2 Samuel 9. He had no reason to think that David wasn't out to get rid of him. But then he was disarmed and more than likely shocked by David's reassurance. The story is told of Thomas Jefferson, who was, he's with a group of companions. They're riding horseback. They're riding cross country, and they came to a river. And there was somebody already there at the river's edge there. They were on foot, and they weren't able to cross the river on foot. And this person who was there, they waited for several of the party that was with Thomas Jefferson to cross. But then this person waved over Thomas Jefferson and asked if Jefferson would carry him across on his horse. So Jefferson pulled up to him and pulled him up onto the back of his horse and carried him to the opposite side of the riverbank, laid him down on the other side. One of the other men who was with Jefferson asked this guy, he said, hey, why did you select the president to ask this favor of? Why did you choose him? And the guy answered, I didn't know he was the president. All I know is that on some faces are written the answer no, and on some faces are written the answer yes. And his was a yes face. What Mephibosheth encountered that day before David was a yes face. Don't be afraid, David said to him. And then he goes on, he says, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And then catch this. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. See, this is the way love looks, not feels, CCC. Generous, extravagant, not holding back, uncalculating. David put content to the word love and the concept of grace when he turned over all the lands of Saul to his grandson, Mephibosheth, so that he'd have an independent income. And he signed Ziba, who had once been a servant to Saul, to manage all of that, take care of all the affairs. And he brought Mephibosheth into his household as one of the family. David brings into his home, around his table, somebody who could have been a threat to his throne, somebody who could have had a legitimate claim to David's throne. See, David's love, it wasn't greeting card sentiment, gang. It literally had the substance of the earth beneath it, along with the regularity of 3 squares a day to reinforce it. It's a remarkable scene. Chuck Swindoll calls it the greatest illustration of grace in the Old Testament. That's the second time we see Mephibosheth, 2 Samuel chapter 9. And that takes us to the third story with Mephibosheth and David that takes place years later. It's in 2 Samuel 16 and chapter 19. And it happens during the era of one of David's sons, Absalom, leading an insurrection against David. And by this time, Mephibosheth, he'd been living for a long time as, a member of the family in David's house, eating his meals there, treated with great honor like one of David's sons, the recipient of the love of the king. And then comes Absalom's revolt. It was kind of a civil war. And he unseats his father. He unseats David from the throne, and he takes over the kingship. And the result is David has to flee. He escapes. He escapes out of Jerusalem. He escapes from the royal palace, and he escapes it all in disgrace. He's just beaten down. And he's got a few faithful followers with him. And one of those followers is Ziba. You remember Ziba, the servant that's assigned to Mephibosheth's household? Well, Ziba flees with David in the flight out of Jerusalem. And when he's asked about the whereabouts of his master, Mephibosheth, he answers that Mephibosheth deliberately stayed behind in Jerusalem. He was believing, he said, that in the confusion and all that upheaval going on, that he had a good chance of being made king. Ziba, in effect, says to David, he says, hey, Mephibosheth has betrayed you, David. He's a traitor. He saw a chance of becoming king and he went for it. But he says, I'm on your side. I'm with you through thick and thin. So David, without asking any questions, he accepts Ziba's story as true. And right there on the spot, he declares that all of Mephibosheth's land, it now belongs to Ziba. Now later on, Absalom is killed. Absalom's defeated. That revolution is put down there. And David returns to Jerusalem once again as the king. And David hears a different story from none other than Mephibosheth himself. Mephibosheth tells David that he was all ready to join David that night when the rebellion broke out, and all that flight out of Jerusalem. But Ziba, he had betrayed him. Ziba left him behind and left him stranded with no way out. And again, he's crippled, so he can't go by himself. He can't go on foot. So the question is, who's telling the truth? Ziba or Mephibosheth? Who's telling the truth? Most folks like to side with Mephibosheth, but there's a deliberate withholding of the verdict by the writer of 2 Samuel in order to give emphasis to David's response. David believed Ziba's accusation when he first heard it. And then as he listens to Mephibosheth, he knows that both stories can't be true. And here's the point. David doesn't care who's telling the truth. There's no cross-examination here. There's no calling in of witnesses. He just accepts both men back into his city, back into his household, back into his kingdom. His love is large enough and expansive enough to handle faithlessness, fickleness, lies, and hypocrisy. See, gang, this is the anticipation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In 2 Samuel 9, David first sought out Mephibosheth from a position of strength. He used his strength to love generously and graciously and even covenantally, we might say. He's uncorrupted by power. Love just flowed from him unimpeded. David treated Mephibosheth with the love with which God had saved him. And now in 2 Samuel 19, there's a second act of love where David, he's not in a position of strength. He's tired from the battles he's just fought. He's barely surviving the worst rejection and betrayal of his life from his own son. And he's grieving the death of his son. And he's abandoned by many of his trusted friends. And now Mephibosheth is before him again, and Ziba's accusation of betrayal is hanging over his head. And David's got to wonder, is Mephibosheth one more who's going to betray his love? If David's been betrayed by his own son, why wouldn't Mephibosheth, with a legitimate claim to the throne, also betray him? Well, get this, CCC. It doesn't matter to David. He doesn't have to know. He takes Mephibosheth's story at face value and he keeps faith with him. He persists in his love of Mephibosheth. David, in his weakness, his kingdom just crumbling around him, is as strong as ever in his love and grace. He's gracious the first time with Mephibosheth, and he's gracious this time too. This, gang, is said, love with sort of covenant steel in it to keep it steady and persistent and committed. I love this picture here in 2 Samuel 19 just as much as I love the picture in 2 Samuel 9. And I think we need this picture here in chapter 19 just as much as we need chapter 9. We need to see David, who in the thick of everything else, administering a new government, dealing with insubordination and rebellious children, and just facing a gamut of trials and temptations, he determines to love an uncompromising stranger and to persist in that love no matter what. And this is the gospel miracle on display when human beings like you and me, from time to time, we evade the temptations of power and the temptations of bitterness, and we actually manage to vulnerably love another person who has all the potential of turning on us and rejecting us. And every time we persist, the gospel is proclaimed and the kingdom of God is made known. We're recreating a picture. And it's our story, CCC. It's the grace of God to us. It's the gospel that's come to us that we hold and we steward. Because just like Mephibosheth, we, in our weakness, had nothing. We deserved nothing, could repay nothing, hiding from God, all broken and fearful. And God sought us out. God pursued us and took us from where we were and brought us to where He is, to a place of fellowship with Him. And then He welcomes us into His family. You sit at my table, He says. You enjoy my food. I give you my life at the cost of my life, He says. We have been adopted into God's family. And it's not just a one-time deal. God persists in His love for us, even when our own allegiance to Him is in question. He continues to call us His sons and His daughters, and He absorbs the cost of our sin and betrayal. Thank God for the grace of God. Is the grace of God the dominant story of your life? Have you discovered it, responded to it, accepted it, received it? Are you assured of it? And are you now living from it? See, just like with God, when David loved you, you stayed loved because there was grace and love in His heart for the most stubborn of people. And man, I want to love like that. I want to recreate a picture like that. I thought of all kinds of people when pulling all this together and reading through all this. I thought of my life. I thought of my friends. I thought of my own family. I thought of a lot of you. I thought of some folks I know, so many people that I cross paths with. And, if I could get to the end of my life and have them say about me, oh man, he loved with a persistent love, and he had grace and love in his heart for all kinds of folks. When he loved somebody, man, when Dave loved somebody, they stayed loved. If I could get to the end of my life and have that said about me, I think I'd be all right. No matter what else I do or don't do, I think I'd be a success in God's eyes. And if that can't be said of me, no matter what else I do or don't do, I think I'd fail. I want a heart that loves with a persistent, hesed kind of love and grace. Is the grace of God the dominant story of your life? I mean, really, what do people say that it is? Well, thank God for the grace of God. Thank God for finding us when we weren't looking and loving us when we weren't worthy, and making us His when we didn't deserve it. Hesed, loving kindness, grace.